Alrighty, welcome. You are finding yourself at the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. It is 2 p.m. And you are in for a great session today. Before I pass it off to our presenters, let me just do a few quick introductory slides. And that is my computer, so no need to worry about that. So first and foremost, thank you for joining the conference. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Danielle Hubly. I manage advocacy and education for the Partnership for Strong Communities. I also have from my team, Don Branson on. In case you run into any tech challenges or need any support, you can reach either of us on this session. This year's conference is centered around thriving communities. And each session spotlights a unique approach to strengthening housing stability for households and communities across Connecticut. You can see our socials. Please join into the conversation since we're fully virtual. It's a great way to be a part of all of the great learning you all are doing today. So like I said, today's session is making connections, linking Connecticut's education finance system to housing opportunities, a really timely and important conversation. And like I said, before I pass it off to our speakers, I just have to thank our sponsors. Our leading sponsor is the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. We also have our visionary sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo. Our champion sponsors are Bank of America, J.D. Amelia and Associates, M&T Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. Our foundation sponsors, who you see on the screen, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Con Resnick, and Trinity Financial. And these sponsors, their deep support really means the world to us and just makes this conference feasible in the way that it is. So thank you so much for your support. And we also have our investor sponsors who are sponsoring today's session, Whittlesey and Navigate Affordable Housing Partners. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much for the sponsors to supporting, again, the conference. A few quick items of housekeeping before I turn it over. This session is being recorded, and all of the content will be available in the coming days and weeks following the conference on our YouTube channel. You've entered muted. Please stay on mute unless a speaker asks you to unmute. And again, like I said at the start, if you have any tech issues or you need any support, just go to the chat icon in your Zoom control panel and send it to, again, Danielle or Dawn, and we'll do our best to assist you as we can. Your speakers will let you know if they have a particular way they would like you to submit questions, but otherwise you can submit them in the chat, and they will be able to read through and answer the questions as they come in. And post your session, please just take a minute to check the little megaphone icon that you see on the screen here in your lobby chat. This links you to, it's only a 9-question survey. It's super quick, but it gives us really important feedback for this year and for next year's conference and for all the conferences we ever host at all. So thank you so much for taking the time to do that. We super appreciate your feedback. And that's really all I had to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters. I'll pass it off to Ashley to get us started.
All right. Well, I'll take over here for now, but thank you, Danielle, for that introduction. And I'm just going to pull up my slides real quick. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Making Connections, Linking Connecticut's Education Finance System to Housing Opportunities. My name is Morgan Considine. I'm the Director of Data at the School and State Finance Project, and I'm joined by my colleague Ashley today as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Robles. I'm a Senior Data Analyst at School and State Finance Project.
Yeah, and as Danielle had mentioned, housing and education funding are very much linked. And today we're going to go over a presentation that explores the relationship between housing in Connecticut and education funding as well. We will go through quite a bit of data, so I'm going to do my best to move us quickly through these slides as we go along. Our contact information can be found here, which will be available with the slides at the end of the session. So just a little bit about our organization, the School and State Finance Project. We are a Connecticut-based statewide organization founded back in 2015. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. We're a 501c3. We seek to serve as a trusted resource who works collaboratively with policymakers, school district officials, and community leaders. And really how we go about doing our work is developing data-driven solutions, mostly advocating at the state level to ensure that the public policies that are put in place are equitable and fairly and equitably fund all students regardless of their race, ethnicity, zip code, economic status, and the like. So just a little bit about what our work has managed to accomplish so far. We have succeeded over the course of our organization's existence to secure approximately $526 million in additional need-based funding for Connecticut's public school students. That's been done primarily through alterations to the state's funding formulas for education. We've directly engaged 15,000 community members on education funding. This is a big part of our knowledge building strategy to help improve the transparency around this important system. And we also serve as an independent and accurate source of research and analysis to state and local decision makers so that they can use the best information available to inform policy solutions that serve the best interests of students in Connecticut. So briefly, this presentation is broken out into several sections. We'll go over a quick overview, and then we're going to talk about how Connecticut's divided by race and wealth, the role of property taxes in education funding, disparities in education funding, access to opportunity through housing and education, the evolution of school funding, and the room for improvement that remains. So, quick overview. We hope today that you will have a good understanding of Connecticut's education finance system by the time you are done with us. We are going to delve into these divisions of race and wealth in Connecticut and how they impact the student experience in education. And we will explore how education funding and housing impact access to opportunity and the improvements that have been made to date. So just in a bit more detail, specifically, property taxes, property wealth, and restrictive zoning play a big role in education funding and educational access in Connecticut. These are the relationships that we're going to explore in more detail as we move through the presentation, as well as the racial funding gap that exists in Connecticut as a result of the history of policies and decisions that exist in the state. And finally, we will do a brief review of how a lack of quality housing limits student opportunities and negatively impacts social mobility. Just a quick housekeeping during the presentation. We highly encourage you to ask questions in the chat box located at the bottom of your screen. We'll address any questions as there's time at the end of the presentation. As Danielle said, please stay muted until called upon or once in breakout rooms. We'll have a couple breakout rooms at the end to facilitate some discussions on what we talked about. And throughout the presentation, we'll be referring to Black, Indigenous, people of color as BIPOC. And we'll just say also we'll have a few polls for some interactivity throughout this presentation. Some of them will be done via QR code. So if you have a phone and would like to participate in the poll, you can scan the QR code and participate through that way. And some of them will also be done through Zoom's poll feature within the meeting's controls. So speaking of which, our first live poll, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley real quick to go through this, but just to kind of get everybody thinking here about this, we want to see where folks are. So if you don't mind taking 2 minutes to just scan the QR code, and I'll have Ashley share her screen and she'll pull it up again as well, to just think about how you think funding impacts education and how housing plays a role in education funding in Connecticut. So with that, I'm going to give Ashley control real fast.
Thanks, Morgan. So as you guys are going to be sharing your responses, this will be kind of popping up on our live screen.
So we have the QR code again as well. And if you choose to respond, we will get some responses that will, again, as Ashley said, they'll pop up there and we'll talk about those. I'm going to give folks just a couple minutes to respond if they'd like to, just because we are time constrained here. But I think the main reason why we wanted to kind of bring this interactivity to people was that before we go into a really data-heavy presentation, we wanted to see where people were coming from, and it'd just be really interesting to see what people know about school finance, because it's a pretty complicated and often not transparent topic, at least in Connecticut. Mm.
The two are very linked.
So I think we're starting here, even from the responses to this poll, is great because we're seeing already a couple big things coming out here. Resources, property taxes, and housing. So as we know, where you live determines where you go to school, and how those schools are funded are determined largely by property taxes and property values, which is a very important intrinsic link in how it works in Connecticut, and also how we've kind of gotten into the state that we are today. So Ashley, I think I will ask for control back, and I'm going to move into the meat of the presentation now. So thank you all for those who have participated in our little experiment there. So, as many astutely pointed out, property taxes and property wealth play a big part in education funding. So, just for a little bit of context, in Connecticut, there's a distinct history of racial and economic segregation in Connecticut. It's a pretty small state, but we have 169 towns, and they are largely separated on the basis of race and wealth. This division is a result of years of exclusionary zoning policies and historical and redlining of keeping BIPOC families and individuals within certain areas of the state and out of predominantly white or wealthier neighborhoods. And this racial and economic segregation has a lasting impact on the economic and educational opportunities for Connecticut residents and their students. So, as we can see here in this map of the state, the darker blue highlighted towns indicate a higher percentage of the town's population that is BIPOC. So we can see that a lot of the diversity in the state is concentrated in a few areas, and they tend to be surrounded in most cases by bordering towns with a lot lower levels of BIPOC individuals. So as we call out here, we have Bridgeport and Fairfield have very distinct differences. Hartford and West Hartford have very distinct differences, and even Middlebury and Waterbury have very distinct differences. And this trend continues when we look at this by income levels as well. So when we examine this from median household income, we can see that in these areas where we have high concentrations of BIPOC populations, they also tend to have lower median household income. And these discrepancies exist sharply with their neighboring communities as well. So this segregation of race and wealth in Connecticut plays a key role in how Connecticut funds education and why its school districts are so segregated. So municipalities that share common borders can expect to have stark differences in race and wealth as a result of discriminatory policies. And with that context of how segregated Connecticut is, it brings us to our first Zoom poll question, which is, which we will explore afterwards, but just before we give you more of the information, our poll question here is: a majority of Connecticut's BIPOC students are concentrated in how many school districts? And for a little bit of context, I'll tell you there are 201 school districts in Connecticut as of today.
So I just launched the poll. Please let me know if you guys cannot see. But we'll give you guys a minute and then I will end the poll.
All right, we have two clear front runners at the moment.
Let me go ahead and end the poll. I'll do one final call. All right, and I'll share the results in one moment. And you should all be able to see that.
All right, looks like most of you said 5, a smaller chunk said 15, and one said 25. All right, well, I'll tell you, to the 4 of you who said 15, you are correct. Majority of Connecticut's BIPOC students are concentrated in just 15 school districts in the state. As we will come to see in some of the following slides. So segregation in education, in the student experience in Connecticut. The segregation across Connecticut cities and towns has a direct impact on the racial and economic makeup of Connecticut school districts. Although Connecticut's school student population is roughly 50% white and 50% BIPOC, individual school districts are not reflective of this aggregate level of diversity. So even though that entire student population, we have over 500,000 students in the state of Connecticut, is about 50-50, most of them are concentrated, like we just said, in those 15 school districts. Connecticut's public school districts are highly segregated, with most students attending a district with more than 75% of the students are white, or a district where more than 75% of the students are BIPOC. So this map is similar to the one that we looked at sooner, but this is from a school district perspective and specifically looking at student race rather than the town population. So we can see a similar story play out between neighboring communities. There are huge discrepancies in the percentage of BIPOC students between neighboring communities. So as we had mentioned in our first poll, property taxes play a big role in education funding in Connecticut. Now that we've gotten the context of the state's economic and racial segregation kind of under our belts, we can move into a discussion here about how they are funded and why the systems in place are the way they are and the inequitability of those systems. So a little bit of information here. This is the total sources of education funding in Connecticut. So there's about $12.1 billion on an annual basis spent on education in Connecticut. Most of that, about 59% of it, is coming from local sources, and that means the vast majority of that is local property tax revenue. So even though the state is spending about $4.5 billion, only about half of that is distributed in a manner that considers student need, or as we would say, distributed in an equitable manner. So even efforts from the state side to try to redistribute funding is not sufficient to close just the sheer magnitude of the gap that's caused by the local sources funding education. And Connecticut receives very little federal funding, so it's fairly negligible. So property taxes, as we know, which are the big driver of this funding source, are very regressive by nature, and our towns and school districts are very reliant on them to pay for their services. Including funding education, which is the primary expenditure of most towns. So municipalities with higher amounts of taxable property can raise more revenue with lower tax rates than municipalities with low property wealth. So we know that if you have a lot of available taxable property, you can set a lower tax rate to raise more money than another town who has less taxable property. That town with less property will have to set a higher tax rate to get a comparable amount of money, but they both need to provide an equal education to their students. So one is going to have a much higher tax effort to get a comparable level of spending on its students to a higher wealth community. Yeah, so as we said, the value of taxable property and mill rates play an important role on the amount of local revenue available to local and regional public school districts. We have some huge discrepancies in grand list values in Connecticut. This is just aggregate, so it's not scaled on a per capita basis, but we'll see that in the next slide. But even still, we have at the smaller end some towns with a few hundreds of millions of property value to towns with dozens of billions of taxable property wealth, which leads to very different pictures for how education is funded and the tax effort that goes into raising funding for education. So this is a scaled picture. We have some extremes on each end here with the state median included, but a lot of Connecticut school districts are between 100 to 200,000, or excuse me, a lot of the towns are between 100 to 200,000 equalized net grand list per capita, which is that total amount of taxable property per person. But a lot of the cities with high concentrations of high needs students and high concentrations of BIPOC populations have much less available taxable property per capita. So they have to have a really high tax effort in order to raise enough money for education that's comparable to wealthier towns who can set lower tax rates because they have more available taxable property. And we can see here, this assumes a $300,000 house in each and every town. So even though the house is worth the same, there's different property taxes on it depending on where it's located. We can see the towns that tend to be lower income and have higher populations of BIPOC students. They have to tax themselves at a higher rate. So the homeowners end up paying a higher tax on that town simply because that is where they have to live at that time. And now, with that context kind of established, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to discuss the disparities in education funding.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, so as Morgan has kind of touched upon, we have a lot of history that we've kind of built, or we have under our belt now, and have a good understanding of kind of the local property taxes. But how has this kind of translated into education funding? Well, what we found is segregation and the school finance system as it currently is has resulted in inequities in Connecticut. One of the most fundamentally flawed parts of our education funding system is its over-reliance on local property taxes. It is often enabled in an inequitable system where affluent, predominantly white communities are able to fund their schools at higher levels. As Morgan has touched upon again, this is just due to they're able to generate a lot more revenue for their schools with a lower effort. And ultimately, this has kind of resulted in a system where a student lives and where they go to school has determined the education funding that they receive, but it has also limited the opportunities that they have for success both in and outside of the classroom. And to kind of help with this kind of understanding of where we're at, our organization has published various studies looking at the education funding. So if we were to break up all districts in Connecticut based upon their student demographics, kind of what is the per student spending within these districts. And once we've broken them up between 0 to 25% BIPOC, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 and above, we have a really, really interesting picture where we see that districts that are more diverse tend to spend less per student. And even when we compare that column all the way to the right and all the way to the left, so districts that are predominantly BIPOC, so districts with 75 and above, versus districts that are predominantly white, 25 and less, or 25% or less BIPOC, there's about a $2,000 difference in per student spending. Morgan, if you don't mind clicking to the next slide. But what does $2,000 less per student actually mean? It's about $58,000 less for a classroom of about 29 students, and it's about $1 million less for an elementary school. So these are, significant losses in revenue not losses in revenue, but these are significant differences in opportunity that these districts have just based on where a student lives and the amount of education funding that's available to their students. So I think the next slide, Morgan, if you don't mind, we'll have another poll question. So when we look at these per student spendings and we try to approximate the total number of dollars, how much is needed to how much is the racial funding gap currently? So if all students were to be funded at the same level as predominantly white communities, how much would that be? So I'm going to launch my second poll in 1 second. And you guys should all be able to see it. And please let me know if you guys can't in the chat. Okay, and then you all should be able to see the results now. So we seem to have it pretty broken up with 47% of you saying $550 million. And the 7 of you would actually be correct. So Morgan, if you would go on to the next slide. So I'll stop my share. There we go. Oh, back one, sorry. There we go. So yeah, so currently the racial funding gap is $555 million. So that's the funding gap between districts serving student populations that are less than 25% BIPOC versus all other districts. So to kind of put this into other words, if the state were to invest dollars into all districts to be funded at the same level as predominantly white, so those white affluent communities, it would require an investment from the state of about $555 million. Now, this is an analysis we've been putting together over the past couple of years, and this has fluctuated over time, but we are still seeing about over $500 million. And even when we look at it versus economic levels, so looking at percent fertile, for example, it is still above $500 million. And again, this has fluctuated over time due to enrollment changes and just changes in overall spending. Morgan, if you wouldn't come there, thank you. But there's just one thing we want to note is that there's a consistent mismatch between the district needs and the district resources. So again, when we break it up So again, when we break it up between the district types, so between 0 and 25% BIPOC, 25 and 50, 50 to 75, and 75 and above, and we look at what is the level of need within these communities, you'll see again a stark difference, where the districts that tend to be predominantly BIPOC also tend to be the districts with greater levels of needs. And again, the districts with 75% BIPOC, we found that about 67% of those are students with that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And again, children with additional learning needs, such as students with disabilities, multilingual learners, or students from a low-income family, have different challenges, and they also require additional support. So for example, a student with disability may require a therapist, a multilingual learner may require an ESL bilingual teacher. They also might require additional learning materials, whereas a student from a low-income family may require an interventionalist or a therapist or social worker. So again, these are different challenges, but they all require different and varying supports. Morgan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So that brings us kind of to our next topic, which is taking a look at the access to opportunity across the state, and kind of taking a look at how easy is it for families to kind of access this greater level of opportunity within the state. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So for years, Connecticut has had one of the largest opportunity gaps in the country. And again, this opportunity gap is the product of significant disparities in funding and the educational experiences accessible to Connecticut students. Again, just kind of building upon the stuff that we've kind of already talked about. And this has resulted in differences in academic achievement, graduation rates, future educational and career opportunities, and overall outcomes for students. There's been various studies that have found that increasing school spending has resulted in better achievement and success for students. So obviously, when you have varying levels of spending across the state, this can obviously lead to differences in achievement and overall success for these students and their families. Morgan, if you wouldn't mind. And again, access to opportunity is not evenly distributed in Connecticut. And housing, again, has played a significant role in determining a student's educational opportunities and their outcomes. So to kind of help talk about this a little bit further, we put together some maps to kind of look at accessing kind of levels of opportunity. So one kind of metric that we looked at was the median home values, and we put together kind of a state map, and with the darker colors being higher median home values. And what we found is that median home values across the state vary significantly, even among bordering communities. So you'll see areas in the Fairfield County, for example, like Greenwich and Darien, with about 1.4 million median home values, and then communities like Bridgeport, just a few towns away, with about $194,000. And one example that we provide with bordering communities is Hartford versus West Hartford. So, for example, if a family were living in Hartford, their median home value would be about $172,000. But to access an area with better opportunity, a bordering community such as West Hartford, they would have to invest, or would have median home values about 336, which is really not accessible for most, if all, families. And then even when we look at gross rent, Morgan, if you would move to the next slide, a similar trend still exists across the state. So again, we pulled some examples. Middlefield and Weston, again, they had very high rents, greater than $3,500. But even when we look at Darien versus Bridgeport, again, almost neighboring communities, there's a stark difference in the gross rent in these communities. And again, when we look at bordering communities, that example with Hartford and West Hartford, it's still about a $400 difference between bordering communities. And for these families to access an opportunity, it would be about $400 more. To kind of push this point, so affordable housing is one way to, so affordable housing is one way to address the high housing costs in Connecticut. So affordable housing seeks to ensure that individuals and families, particularly those with low incomes, have access to housing that does not consume an overwhelming portion of their income. Affordable housing allows families to move into areas with greater opportunities for them and for their children, including attending well-resourced schools. However, Connecticut, Morgan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. However, Connecticut has very limited affordable housing across the state. So approximately 12% of all units in Connecticut are affordable. And most are concentrated in our high-need communities, so such as Hartford, that you'll see that bright blue in the middle, New Haven down on the shoreline, and then Wyndham and Waterbury throughout the state. And typically areas with greater opportunity, so those lighter colors that you'll see in the map, they typically tend to have low number and percentage of affordable housing units. So even when you try to access an area with greater opportunity, there's a very limited supply for these families. And again, kind of why do we have this system? And that's ultimately a result of local zoning laws. So local zoning laws in Connecticut often restrict the development of affordable housing, whether that be by imposing stringent regulations or by limiting where such housing can be built. And all of this has kind of resulted in very limited affordable housing throughout the state. Morgan, if you can, there you go. And again, just to kind of link that relationship a little bit more between affordable housing and the educational experience, we decided to put together some scatter plots. So each dot represents a town. And then for each graph on the horizontal axis, you'll see that's the percent of affordable housing within these communities. And then on those vertical axis on the left, for example, we have the percent BIPOC. So from this diagram, you can look at the percent affordable versus the percent BIPOC. And what we have found is that typically a town with more affordable housing tends to be more diverse, more students with BIPOC, or more students identified as BIPOC. Whereas the figure to the right, the percent affordable housing on the bottom versus the per pupil expenditures, so how much a district spends per student, you'll find more of a negative trend where ultimately districts with more affordable housing tend to spend less per pupil. And again, I think this kind of builds upon that point that Morgan had made previously, that districts are so reliant on local property taxes, and that since these districts have to rely on their local resources, they're not able to generate as much for their schools. So districts that are more high need, have more affordable housing, are generally spending less per student. Morgan, if you go to the next slide. Oh, I think, sorry. Yeah, no, you're okay. So I guess that brings us to our third poll question. So how does affordable housing impact students? So I'm going to launch that poll. Just give me one moment. There we go. So how does affordable housing impact students and families? So we have 4 options here. So 1, affordable housing reduces the frequency of disruptive moves. 2, affordable housing can help families move to communities with higher quality schools. 3, affordable housing can alleviate cost burdens on families and allow them to spend more on education and enrichment. Or D, all of the above. So we'll just give you guys a minute to kind of fill those in, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about the research that's been done regarding affordable housing and education.
Also, I'll point out, just going to jump in real fast, I see a lot of great discussion happening in the chat as well, and we'll be breaking you all out into 2 rooms at the end of this session to kind of facilitate more of this conversation as you explore some local data as well to inform the questions that we are going to provide you with as well.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close my poll, and we should be able to see all the answers. There we go. So the correct answer was actually D, all of the above. So Morgan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, where we'll kind of cover all that research that's been done. So again, research has shown that housing instability negatively impacts the educational outcomes for children. And it was found that students living in affordable housing who attend low poverty schools outperform their peers attending or living in affordable housing attending moderate poverty schools. And low income children experience positive school effects from attending the economically integrated schools created by inclusionary zoning policies. So there's been a lot of research that shows like the benefits of affordable housing, but in Connecticut, again, there's been a lack of affordable housing, a lack of integration. And again, this is just due to, as we've covered already, like the history of Connecticut. But this again has continued to like exacerbate inequities, both in education, but I think just in overall outcomes for these families. But kind of one way Connecticut has worked to address this, Morgan, if you mind going to the next slide. So one way Connecticut has addressed the lack of access to opportunity is through school funding. So local zoning laws, again, make it difficult for lower income families to access well-resourced school districts through affordable housing. So the state of Connecticut has attempted to rectify this lack of access to opportunity by providing more funding to low-income school districts directly, whether that be through the phase-in of the ECS formula, targeting more dollars to students with higher needs. But the state of Connecticut has also increased access to choice educational options, whether that be open choice, integrated magnets, so those BOE or RESTS magnets, and then through charters. And additional funding and choice options have improved the situation, but there's a lot more work to be done, which Morgan will kind of cover in the next few sections.
Thank you, Ashley. So school funding in Connecticut has evolved over time. And it's been this issue of access to quality schools and ease of funding education through various property taxes and amounts of taxable property is a long-standing problem in Connecticut, and the state has sought several measures to try and address these issues, which we'll explore a bit here. So how did we get here? So primary sources of education funding are relatively simple. You know, we can think of that bar chart we looked way back. The federal government, the state government, and local governments, provide some funding for education, and that's what we have to spend. But the mechanisms for allocating this funding is not straightforward. Particularly when it comes to how the state of Connecticut provides funding to its public schools. We have a complicated web of 11 different funding formulas for distributing education, and only actually two of which now consider student need into how those funds are distributed. So one of those, the ECS formula, or the education cost sharing formula, is used to distribute the bulk of the state's education aid. That's about $2.2 billion a year of education aid directly to municipalities for their local and regional public school districts. But as I had said, there are a lot of other funding formulas, including funding formulas for magnet schools, open choice programs, vocational agriculture programs, special education, different types of magnet schools. So there's a tangled web of funding formulas, and more of them should consider student need as in how they distribute funding. So, but taking a step back and looking at how Connecticut distributes the bulk of this aid to towns for funding public education. When we talk about the ECS formula, this goes way back in time to 1977, when we talk about the Connecticut Supreme Court decision on Horton v. Meskel. So the court ruled that the current education funding system allows property wealthy towns to spend more on education with less effort, is a system that impedes children's constitutional rights to an equal education. So this goes back almost 50 years and has been a known problem. And as a result, the legislature passed the first incarnation of the ECS formula, which began to consider town wealth and in how funding was distributed, but as opposed to just distributing a flat per student amount, which is what the state was doing previously. But the state hasn't always held true to its promise to distribute aid in this way. And it's only recently in 2017 and implemented and created in 2017 and implemented in 2019 that the current ECS formula that we have now is being, I would say, loyally followed by the legislature, and aid is going out the door in a more equitable manner. So as I was alluding to, the equity considerations of the ECS formula, while its creation was a huge step forward in creating a more equitable education system, more work still remains to ensure all students have the resources they need to succeed. Specifically, some of the areas for improvement include fully and fairly funding all public school students based on their learning needs. While the formula was implemented in 2019, it was put on a phase-in schedule that was not slated to complete until fiscal year 2028. So that means that our highest need school districts still were not being funded at a full level. Even as time goes on, those funding levels are increased, but it has not reached the full form that the formula intends. However, in the most recent legislative session, that phase-in schedule was ramped up and increased. So now, rather than completing in fiscal year 2028, it'll now complete in fiscal year 2026, which will make a substantial difference for a lot of the highest need communities in the state, because that's tens of millions more dollars of consistent and reliable funding that they can use for their local school districts. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, there's a complicated web of funding formulas in this state, and addressing the way that the state uses those formulas and attaching them to student need is more work that needs to be done in this area. And the state should make significant strides in reducing Connecticut's economic and racial funding gaps, as Ashley had talked about earlier, with the racial funding gap in the state of about $550 million. More needs to be done because we are short funding a lot of the kids in this state. And the root of all of this goes back to local property taxes. If we continue to rely so heavily on local property taxes for our education funding, this will continue to remain a gap that is in need of closing. So there's room for improvement based on all of that. So only solving school funding on its own does not fix all of these problems, this lack of opportunity. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on the education finance side, as we talked about. There's also a lot of work that has to happen on the housing side. Breaking the cycle of segregation and funding inequities will require equally deliberate large-scale intervention on both the housing and school finance sides of the equation. Resources matter in education. Access to opportunity matters. Families should have greater mobility and access to schools that they believe their children can go to, schools that are well-resourced regardless of where they are. So this is the kind of the crux of this presentation, is that although there is this lack of opportunity for students in Connecticut, and a lot of students of color or high need students, and tackling it from both a school finance and a housing perspective is, critical to making sure that these students, oops, I think I just went back to the beginning by accident, is critical to getting these students access to opportunity. So just 1 second while I find my place again. Sorry about that. Okay, so what additional strides have we made in addressing these problems? In the most recent legislative session, we got a historic $150 million investment in K-12 public education. I think it's the second largest single expenditure in Connecticut's education funding history. So it's a big step forward in helping to close a lot of these gaps, but it remains uncertain as to how exactly some of those funds will be spent in the upcoming fiscal years. So that's something that our organization will be specifically working on in the upcoming legislative session. Yeah, a quicker path to full funding for school districts, as I had mentioned earlier. Increasing that ECS phase-in is a big deal for cities like Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Britain, New London, New Haven, these cities that have been historically underfunded, and children that have been consistently underfunded. Increasing the phase-in to complete sooner is going to have a big cumulative effect on the budgets and the resources available for these school districts. A more equitable education funding formula. Yeah, there's a lot of education funding formulas. ECS is a more equitable formula. And we have helped improve it by increasing the amount of money that goes out to multilingual learners and low-income students. But again, this is just one formula out of many that the state uses. So more work needs to be done here. All right. And as we near the end, I think we've got just over 10 minutes left. So I think we've got enough time for some breakout rooms. And I'm going to have Ashley break you up into breakout rooms. And there's kind of two topics of discussion. Each room will get a topic to discuss and some visualizations that they can explore to inform those discussions. So Ashley, go ahead.
Yep. So I'm just going to quickly run through each visualization just so that way you guys have a good understanding. So the first one will be of maps and showing the bordering communities and where I guess the most prevalent areas of segregation lie. You'll see on the visualizations, there's dots that represent, I think it was over 25% of differences a 25 percentage point difference. And then the second visualization is the ECS interactive tool. So you'll be able to see the racial disparity gap and then changes to the ECS formula and how that will impact changes to your community. I've also put the visualizations in the chat, so you guys should be able to access those. And then I'll break you out into two groups. And while you're in your groups, I would encourage you to kind of share the conversations that you've been putting in the chat. This is some really informative stuff, and especially with a good idea of what's going on in your communities, you can see kind of the data to support what you're seeing versus what you're experiencing. And I think get a good understanding of kind of where that's going. So again, just share what you're observing and how this is impacting your specific community with those in your group. So just give me one moment. And then I also keep seeing questions in the chat, so we'll definitely address those when we come back. So just give me one moment.
All right. We are just about out of time. So I'm going to just bypass the last few slides of our presentation because it'll be available for you all to take a look at. But our organization does have plenty of resources available on this subject, as well as certificate opportunities for you all to learn more about education finance if you'd like to as well. We got a lot of great questions in the chat and in my session as well. I think one of the great ones was how is that foundation amount for the ECS formula derived? And the answer is it's completely arbitrary and it's not based on research or adequate resources for student need, and is a place for serious improvement in the future. And I saw another question about increases for inflation or increased spending over time. Yeah, these things are not accounted for either. Costs go up over time. Inflation happens over time. So these aren't things that are in there either, because it's hard to advocate for continued increases in funding, but it's a worthy, it's still a worthy cause, and we do say that it is something that these formulas should contemplate. So I'm going to end it here before we go too much over time, but thank you all for attending our presentation, and please feel free to reach out to Ashley and I with any questions, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.